An intro video on blueprinting. Specifically, I'm going to go through some blueprinting examples within Chemistry 30. The first part of blueprinting is building the test that you ultimately want to blueprint. I tend to do this by hand. I try to gather a lot of questions that I think have covered the outcome, have covered all the general outcomes, and obviously it wouldn't be totally balanced, but I just build probably more questions that I need. I like to search through other teachers' questions to use as a guide, maybe modify them. I know that in Ontario, grade 12 chemistry's course code is SCH for you. So I like to go and pull up Ontario teachers' tests. If I'm doing chemistry 20, SCH 3U is the Ontario course code. Now it's a large province and there's a vast amount of practice tests sampled online. So I'll probably build a test that is maybe 10, 20, 30% too big, and then I can start blueprinting, labeling each question from which outcomes in the program of study it connects to, and start weeding out when I have maybe 5 questions on the same outcome and it just isn't appropriate, and I can pick the questions that I think are best. So when I get into the blueprinting part, I personally take a Google Doc. I pull all the general outcomes. There's often 2 specific outcomes. So in this case, they're labeled D1 and D2. And there's several outcomes under the general outcomes. Okay, I'm going to go through, look at each question, label them. Sometimes questions will show up as multiple outcomes. Okay, so the question count listed here won't match the questions on the test because there will be repetition. Zooming in a little bit, these are just the first 3 from that previous list. The first outcome, I have a couple questions on my test from that outcome. MC means multiple choice. Outcome number 2, the D1.2, write, interpret chemical equations. That's a very vague outcome, so I don't get too worried about this one. There's just questions all over the test on it. So I didn't blueprint this particular question. I'd end up listing almost every question on the test within that outcome. Next is a very important outcome that is sort of 1/3 of a whole chapter. So the rows of outcomes doesn't match the depth within the course. So this outcome, I have 4 or 5 questions just on that. Okay, you've got a whole temperature section, pressure, volume section. So don't worry when you blueprint that every one outcome has to have just 1 question. This is a very subjective part of the test in making sure that you've balanced sort of the depth of the unit with your questions, not a 1-to-1 outcome question ratio. So this is an example of a question from one of my tests. After I get the data for this question, I can go back and decide if I want to change some of the answers, if there's a bad descriptor, or maybe the results are just too low and I want to omit it. I can go back to my list and make sure I know exactly what outcome this question is pertaining to and decide how I want to modify my test accordingly. Now, I always put a code on the top of my tests. And as I do revisions, I just update this code 1 number. So if I make another version of this test, I'm going to call it CVC, which happens to be my initials, and I'll just call it version 2. And I can update this list or make another column if need be. I can find it confusing sometimes to make sure I pull the right test to print for students, and having this code really helps me very fast know exactly what version of the test that I'm using. This is just another test, blueprinting electrochem. Electrochem has a lot more detailed questions. They tend to be slower to go through, so we don't have as many questions on the test. So I'm often down to just 1 outcome and 1 question. The second outcome is really big. Defining OAs, RAs would be 1 lesson topic, oxidation numbers another, half reactions another. So I do have multiple outcomes. I've decided that this outcome warrants more point value on the test than just 1 question. Again, we still see some very sort of universal questions, and I just have many there. Okay. Zooming in a little bit, we can see the first general outcome questions. Again, sometimes there is repetition, so question 11, I've tagged it in multiple outcomes, both the OARA and the spontaneity section. So this is question number 11 that again I've listed and tagged to 2 different outcomes, which is really important. If I go to edit this question, I've got to really watch how it changes the balance of my test. So if this question had bad results and I throw it out, it's going to take a lot more work in tweaking. I may end up replacing this one question with 2 separate ones to maintain the balance on my test. Last is talking about short answer. I like to have short answer contain many outcomes. I think there's a big danger in short answer that you assign 4 or 5 marks, maybe out of 30, and you only test 1 or 2 outcomes, and you really have too many points based on one outcome. I do like to have the short answer have lab or observation type questions, so connecting the outcome in the chemistry to what color you might get, or whether it bubbles or precipitates, or what the pH might be. There's often maybe drawing and experimental setup here. And a short answer is a chance for students to show you process, which obviously you don't get in multiple choice. And it can be difficult to assess students, or a little unfair if they have to do 3 steps and you just mark them wrong because their final process was wrong in multiple choice. So that's where short answer can help you. Again, I tend to have a bit of repetition in the short answer, so they're going back over outcomes, but there'd be outcomes that I would deem to be really important and worthy of having a second mark assigned to it. So example of this from redox, we give students cell notation, and then we cover maybe a third of the curriculum or so with having them understand the cell. We've got the drawing and labeling, and they're going to talk about observations they would see in terms of whether mass increases or decreases. Okay? And you really got to watch these point values. Sometimes teachers will say, oh, there's 3 parts to this question. 3 steps, I'm going to assign 3 marks, but then it makes the marks very imbalanced from a 1-point multiple choice. So watch your point values that you assign in the short answer and balance them off what an outcome is worth on the multiple choice. So hopefully this helped you and gives you some ideas of how you may want to develop your own tests or blueprint existing tests. Okay? Hopefully you have Word or Google Doc versions of your tests that after you blueprint it, you can go back and make some changes.